I'm Tim Marshall. I'm the provost at the New School, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everyone here for this wonderful event to launch Dr. Laura Auricchio's new book, which is right here. The Marquis de Lafayette Reconsidered, which came out this month, published by Alfred A. Knopf Publishers. This has been researched over the course of 7 years. It's a major biography that delves into the personal life and the insights of the passionate French hero of the American Revolution over several tumultuous decades. The book provides both an intimate depiction of some of the towering figures of this historical period, while also illuminating and exploring the new role of the press and public opinion in the politics of the time. The personal letters of the Marquis de Lafayette, which can be found in the collections of the Library of Congress and at Cornell University, provide many of the book's anecdotes. And now a few words about Laura Auricchio. She is a specialist in 18th century French history and art, and she received her undergraduate degree from Harvard and her PhD from Columbia University. She's been a recipient of major fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, the Whiting Foundation, and Columbia University. Currently, Dr. Auricchio serves as the Dean at the School of Undergraduate Studies at the New School for Public Engagement, for which I am extremely grateful. She's doing an amazing job. Before I close, one of the reasons why I accepted Laura's kind invitation to come and open this event is I'm still actually miffed that she never gave me a job that I applied for, but she knocked me back on, was to be her driver around France, visiting chateaus and castles. I don't think she took me seriously, but I thought that was a great gig, and I'm still very disappointed you didn't take me up on the offer, but nevertheless, congratulations on a wonderful book. It's an incredible piece, I'm sure. I'm looking forward to reading it, but I just love the fact that it actually is like a real heavy book. It's, thank God it's not electronic. I think it's, so, Laura, please come up. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, but thank you especially, Tim. Yes, as I explained to Tim at the time, the reason that the job went to somebody else was it went to a Scotsman who promised to wear a kilt as he drove me throughout the Auvergne, and he did. And when we... Well, you would have done. And when we stopped at a truck stop at one point in the middle of the Auvergne, I was the only woman in the truck stop, and he was the only one in a skirt. So it made for quite the scene. But thank you, Tim. I am sincerely indebted to Tim in particular for all of his support throughout my 12 years here at the New School. I'm also deeply grateful to the rest of the leadership at the New School, David Van Zandt, Mary Watson, and also today, particularly to Pam Tillis and Brandon Fisher, who've done a tremendous job of organizing this event, and Luis Jaramillo, the director of the graduate writing program at the New School, with whom we will be in conversation later. I also wanted to take a moment just to issue a few personal and professional thanks to Vicki Wilson, my wonderful editor at Knopf, Brittany Morangelo, the wonderful publicist at Knopf, Audrey Silverman, the wonderful assistant to Vicki Wilson at Knopf, as well as my family, husband, and friends and colleagues who have all turned out tonight to make a completely full house, which just absolutely flatters me. So to let you know what we're going to be doing this evening, the plan is for me to read for just about 15 minutes, and then I look forward to speaking with you and with Luis about the book at greater length. The book covers Lafayette's entire life, which lasted from 1757 to 1834, so quite a long period of time. And Lafayette lived a very tumultuous and exciting life. For that reason, the book really focuses primarily on two large episodes of his life, the two episodes that really defined him. This was his period during the American Revolution and during the French Revolution. So today, I'm going to read again for no more than 15 minutes from a section about the French Revolution. On October 5th, 1789, alarm bells sounded through the gray Paris dawn as thousands of market women streamed towards the Hôtel de Ville. The women, known to their critics as poissardes or fishwives, wielded pikes and pitchforks as they hauled heavy cannons across the cobblestones of the Place de Grève. When Lafayette reached the scene later that morning, the National Guard had just managed to roust a crowd of would-be arsonists from the government building. The guardsmen strained to stem the furious tide of people pouring into the quays along the Seine and the adjacent streets. Incensed by the soaring price of flour, which left them unable to feed their families, the women were joined by husbands, brothers, and sons, all of whom shouted for bread. They were certain that an aristocratic plot was at the root of their starvation. To Versailles, they clamored, as Lafayette struggled to prevent a march that was rapidly becoming inevitable. From 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, Lafayette refused to sanction a march to Versailles and forbade the Guard, whose loyalties were beginning to waver, from undertaking any such action. Back and forth he went, alternating between closed-door meetings with elected representatives of the Paris Commune and high-decibel debates with the crowd on the Place de Grève. Convinced that an attack on Paris was imminent, a young lieutenant in the Grenadiers named Mercier cried out, "My general, the king has fooled us all, you and everyone else. He must be deposed." But still, Lafayette refused. Finally, between 4 and 5, he came to understand that any opportunity to prevent a march had passed, and as an intrepid contingent dominated by women and men armed with knives, pikes, picks, and pitchforks started pulling cannons toward Versailles. In the meantime, the weather had grown steadily worse. Powerful winds had sprung up and a chilling rain was falling, but the crowd's determination showed no sign of flagging. After obtaining a face-saving command from the Paris Commune, who authorized, even ordered him to transport himself to Versailles, Lafayette mounted his white horse and took charge of several National Guard regiments. Together, Lafayette and his troops accompanied a crowd of some 30,000 armed and angry Parisians, arrayed 6 abreast, on a 7-hour trek along 14 miles of dark and muddy roads. According to Marie Antoinette's lady-in-waiting, Madame Campan, news that the National Guard had set out from Paris reached Versailles that afternoon while the king was hunting at Meudon, about 6 miles away, and the queen was alone, lost in painful thought, in her beloved gardens near the Trianon Pavilion, not far from the spot where Lafayette's grandfather, Édouard, had taken a fatal fall in 1736. The royal household leapt into action. The Marquis de Coubière, equerry to the king, set out on horseback to encourage Louis XVI to abandon that day's hunt and return to the palace. The Comte de Saint-Priest, a government minister charged with overseeing the king's household, sent a letter to Marie Antoinette urging the royal family to depart immediately for the Château de Rambouillet, some 20 miles southwest. And servants began packing bags and loading carriages so that the royal family could be whisked to safety. A few carriages were already on the road when an update arrived. The first Parisian women were drawing near. Versailles had not been designed to withstand a military attack, but now its limited defenses were mobilized. Gates that had stood open for a century were pulled shut and locked. The Flanders Regiment assembled on the Place d'Armes, the rounded plaza in front of the chateau, and the Swiss Guard made ready to stand its ground in the inner courtyards and gardens. These and other preparations were in progress when Louis XVI and his entourage returned bearing new orders. The king had passed the Parisian women as he made his way back from the hunt, and he had been gratified to hear cries of "Vive le roi! Long live the king!" from the crowd. Reassured that he would be safe at Versailles, he called off the move to Rambouillet, and, worried that a show of royal force would cause, rather than prevent, an escalation of violence, he ordered the Flanders Regiment to retire to its barracks. The men dutifully obeyed, but as they made their way from the Place d'Armes to their quarters, they found themselves pelted with rocks and gunshot. When Louis heard the news, he began to reconsider his decision, but, as Madame Campan put it, the moment to flee was lost. Lafayette knew none of this, as he made his way slowly toward Versailles to meet a fate that was uncertain at best. As Governor Morris described events in his diary, Lafayette marched by compulsion, guarded by his own troops who suspected and threatened him. Yet this was the selfsame Lafayette who had managed to keep his head at Barren Hill as the redcoats bore down on his detachment from three sides. And now, in 1789, he still possessed the composure that had served him so well in 1778. With scores of lives in his hands, not only his own and his companions, but also the lives of the royal family, he did everything in his power to ensure a peaceful resolution. With the sound of drums and the flicker of torches heralding his approach, Lafayette halted the march around 11 o'clock near the National Assembly's meeting hall in Versailles. There, he administered an oath to remind his troops of their allegiances. The men swore to honor the nation, the law, and the king before continuing on. While two officers were sent ahead to the chateau bearing assurances that Lafayette came to protect the king and not to oust him, a representative of the king appeared to inform Lafayette that Louis saw his approach with pleasure and that he had just accepted his Declaration of Rights. Happily, everyone was in agreement on one point. They wanted to see as little bloodshed as possible. Expectant cries filled the air as Lafayette drew closer to the palace. "Long live the king, long live the nation, long live Lafayette and liberty," shouted the contingent of Parisians who had been driven by fear and desperation to slog through miles of mud on the road to Versailles. Leaving his troops, Lafayette approached the Place d'Armes around midnight, accompanied by two civilians representing the Paris city government. Facing him from the other side of the padlock grille, the Swiss guard hesitated. Wary though they were of Lafayette's motives, they admitted him to the courtyard, and from there into the chateau, up the stairs, and to the Salon de l'Œil de Bœuf, the very antechamber where he had waited the king in 1774 when he was presented at court. But on this occasion, the room was filled with shouts instead of whispers. "There's Cromwell," went the cry. But Lafayette rejected the comparison to the British general who had helped orchestrate the execution of King Charles I during the English Civil War. "Monsieur," Lafayette snapped, "Cromwell would not have entered alone." Still, the accusation struck a chord. Lafayette knew all too well that, with one false move, instead of being a guardian, he would have been a usurper. As the Marquis de la Tour du Pin remembered the scene, Lafayette's voice filled with emotion as he explained to Louis the reasoning that compelled him to march. "Sire, I thought it better to come here, to die at the feet of your majesty, than to die uselessly on the Place de Grève." Louis XVI was in no position to argue. He gave Lafayette free run of Versailles. By 2 a.m, some semblance of order had been established. With the king's guards maintaining calm inside the palace and National Guardsmen patrolling the grounds, Marie Antoinette felt secure enough to go to sleep, with 4 ladies stationed in chairs pushed up against her bedroom door. At 4:30, hearing shouts and gunshots ringing through the palace, they roused her. Giving the queen no time to dress, they hustled her through a narrow door and down a back passageway toward the king's chambers, tossing a petticoat after her. As though in a French farce gone grievously awry, the ladies reached the king's door only to find it locked. They knocked and were let in, but by then Louis was gone. He had taken the more public route to the queen's bedroom at the first sound of alarm. In the adjacent Salon de l'Œil de Bœuf, royal guards faced off against armed citizens while the queen reunited with her children and retreated to the bedroom. At last, a rapprochement involving the exchange of cockades was reached in the Salon de l'Œil de Bœuf, and calm returned to the chateau. Daybreak found Lafayette conferring with the king and queen in their apartments, where the Parisian troops now fraternized with the royal guardsmen. From the marble court below, the clamor grew louder and more menacing. The people were calling in angry tones for Marie Antoinette. At first, they got only Lafayette, who harangued them from the balcony to little effect. He stepped back inside, and speaking again with the uneasy monarchs, he brokered another deal. If they came with him to Paris, as the crowd demanded, he would guarantee their safety. They agreed. With that, Lafayette turned to the queen. "Come with me." "What, alone? On the balcony?" "Yes, madam, let us go." Together, Lafayette and Marie Antoinette appeared before the angry crowd. Unable to make himself heard, Lafayette resorted to a gesture that would later be cited by his enemies as a sign of double dealing. He kissed the hand of the Queen. With this gallant pantomime, Lafayette bestowed his blessing on Marie Antoinette and changed the hearts of the people. Long live the general, long live the Queen. To the sound of cheers, the pair left the balcony and began preparing for the journey ahead. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon of October 6, 1789, the royal family set out from Versailles in a carriage. Inside, Marie Antoinette clutched her coffer of diamonds. Outside, Lafayette rode beside the monarchs on a handsome white horse, keeping pace with the coach. 100 carriages followed behind, bearing the National Assembly's deputies, while thousands of exhausted citizens and soldiers joined the historic journey on foot. It was 6 in the evening before Lafayette reached the Hôtel de Ville, and quite dark by the time the royal family moved into a rambling suite of hastily evacuated apartments in their new home, the Tuileries Palace, which stretched along the banks of the Seine just west of the Louvre. There, Louis was fated to live by Lafayette's rules and under Lafayette's authority. On the morning of October 7th, Lafayette attended what could only have been a very awkward ceremonial levee in the king's new chambers. For better or for worse, it seemed that Louis XVI would always have Lafayette at his side. That the march to Versailles ended so calmly was nothing short of extraordinary. October 5th had witnessed its share of fatalities. The heads of 2 royal bodyguards had been transported to Paris on pikes. But large-scale carnage had been avoided, and much of the credit belonged to Lafayette. His uncommon ability to think clearly under pressure and his unparalleled credibility with the crowd had allowed him to wrest control from mayhem. That night, Lafayette proved to the world that he deserved his reputation as Washington's protege. But the future would bring challenges that might have been too much for any man. Thank you.
So I was just struck yet again by how detailed that part was that you read. And I know that every single bit of that was researched. So I wonder if you could just talk us through some of that research, like, especially the last bit when Lafayette turns to the Queen and says, "Come with me to the balcony."
Sure. So thank you, and thank you for the question. So yes, 7 years of research, you get a lot of detail. And a good deal of it ends up on the proverbial cutting room floor. But the trick for me in actually writing this book was because Lafayette did live so long and his life was so full of adventure, the trick was figuring out which episodes to focus on and then trying to bring those to life as fully as I could through as much detail as I could. So in some cases, the detail comes from newspapers or journals. In this case, that particular piece of detail comes from memoirs of Lafayette. And there are actually many different accounts of that same event that were written by many, many different people. And so part of the trick also has been to sort of sort out what seems most credible and what doesn't. That section seems to be verified by a couple of different people, but it's presented exactly as Lafayette presented it.
And do you when you're writing a book like this, do you only put in elements that you verified?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes, and one thing, when you're dealing with a figure like Lafayette, for example, who's so beloved by so many Americans and has been so much written about, what you find is that in the secondary literature, you find a lot of untruths or half-truths or partial truths or wishful thinking. All of the above, really, so that it becomes, I became somewhat obsessive, I'd say, about trying to verify the sources for each one of these anecdotes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was taken by something you posted on your Facebook account, which is a picture of some building at Lafayette College And the lore at Lafayette College is that that Lafayette changed his motto to "Cur non," which is "Why not," which is a very nice story. So I guess if you could talk a little bit about, just give us a scope of what does life look like? He came to the United States, the colonies, when he was 19, and then what did the rest of his life look like?
So first of all, I think it's important to think about why he came to the colonies when he was 19. It's one of the things that I think has not necessarily been really sort of fully understood, the fact that he was 19 and the fact that in fact he had never seen a day of battlefield action before he came here. So it's not as though he was a general who was experienced, who was just coming over to share his knowledge. He was also coming to America to reinvent himself, in the same way that many millions of Americans have before and since come in order to create a new life. The fact that a Marquis might want to create a new life is something that seems somewhat surprising. But it turns out that he was actually somewhat of a fish out of water where he was. He was at Versailles, but he was married into the court nobility. But he was someone who came from the provinces, and he came from a very sort of rustic family, and he did not have the graces that he needed to succeed as a courtier in Versailles. So he came here, and in America, he found his second chance, I'd say. And here, George Washington gave him an opportunity to really hone his skills as a military general. And he became a hero both in America and France for his great successes here. He went back to France and as an American hero. And part of his story that I think is so interesting is that in America, he was beloved as a Frenchman in America, but in France, he was always sort of seen as an American in France. So he sort of lived his life almost between two worlds. During the French Revolution, that really became apparent when he tried to chart a middle course between the radical Republicans on one side, Robespierre, and the people who wanted to create an American-style republic in France, and on the other side, the people who supported an absolute monarchy and did not want to give over any power. So he was trying to, again, chart this sort of middle path. Ended up having to flee the French Revolution for his life. His head was being called for when he fled. He lived for many, many years after that. French Revolution starts in 1789. He lives to 1834. And he's involved with many, many more episodes, many, many more political events. But none of them ever really compared, I think, to his moments in the American and French Revolutions, which are the two that really came to define his life and came to define his very different legacies on the two sides of the Atlantic.
And how did you come to Lafayette as a subject?
Well, he traveled in the same circles as the artist about whom I wrote my first book. Her name was Adélaïde Labille-Guiard, and nobody has really heard of her. But they should have, because she's a wonderful painter, and in fact, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has what is probably her masterpiece. It's a very large self-portrait with two students, and she's seated behind an easel wearing this enormous, beautiful dress. Anyway, she traveled during the French Revolution in the same circles, these moderate circles that wanted to reform but not abolish the French monarchy. That got me interested in this area of history because it seemed to me that that middle ground has sort of dropped out of the story. We know about Robespierre and the Reign of Terror, and we know about Marie Antoinette and Let Them Eat Cake and so forth, but we don't really know that there were people in between. My particular approach to Lafayette, though, the approach I took in this book really was formed by my interactions, though, with people in France. And the book actually opens with my conversation with a curator at Versailles who has very generously devoted a portion of an afternoon to bringing me to see a bust of Lafayette. And of course, the bust of Lafayette is not kept any place where anybody would ever actually go in Versailles. It's in an outbuilding, and you have to, walk across courtyards, and he couldn't find the right key. And this was something he had not ever been asked to do before, to locate the bust of Lafayette. So we get to the room, and it's a little dusty because nobody's been there in a while. And I'm looking at this bust, and the curator says in French, "Why should we have a bust of Lafayette?" And I thought that maybe my French was faltering, so I said, "Pardon?" And he said it again, but just louder and a little slower. And so I started to tell him naively why we should have a bust of Lafayette, that he was the hero. He was not impressed. He then gestured to a plaque that was installed a few feet away, and this was a plaque that commemorated the lives of thousands of French soldiers and sailors who had died during the American Revolution. And he said, "Look, thousands of men died, Frenchmen died for your revolution. You don't know their names. Louis XVI bankrupted the country for the American Revolution, and he received his thanks from the guillotine. Rochambeau led the French forces in America. Nobody knows his name. Why do you revere Lafayette?" Well, that got me thinking. And what I started to understand was that Lafayette's actions and reputation during the French Revolution left him with a very, very different legacy there than he has here. So that in France, as I alluded to in that section, he was really seen as sort of a double dealer. The monarchists, the royalists, thought that he was a traitor to his class and nation because he, after all, brought a murderous crowd to his door at Versailles. On the other hand, the Republicans, small r Republicans in France, felt that he was too close to the monarchy and actually either wanted to shore up the monarchy or perhaps replace it with himself. So that question of sort of how one man who actually had very similar principles throughout his entire life could have possibly developed two such different reputations is really what motivated me to write the book as I did.
Well, your story about the man who asked you the question after reading and related the story about the Champ de Mars.
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. So yes, I was at Lafayette College last week. It was actually the first place that I spoke about Lafayette 2 days after the book came out. And a man in the audience came up to me afterwards, and it was extremely interesting. He said, I came here because I was in France this summer. And he said, I was there for 10 days, and I took one of those hop-on, hop-off buses that you take in Paris. And he said that as the hop-on, hop-off bus went past the Eiffel Tower, they said, the guide on the hop-on, hop-off bus said, this is the Champ de Mars, the park where the Eiffel Tower is situated, and this is where Lafayette fired on the people during the French Revolution. And he sort of had a point. Lafayette was the commander of the French National Guard, which, due to a series of very unfortunate circumstances, did in fact open fire on a group of people who were clamoring to declare the monarchy abdicated in 1791. Now, the man who came to my lecture at Lafayette College came to find out if that was true, because it didn't seem to him possible that it could in fact be true. But it is true, and it's evidence, I think, of the legacy that Lafayette has left in France, which is so tremendously different from any vision that we have of him in America.
Yeah, it makes you look at the Eiffel Tower in a different way, too. If it's a place of, it's like Kent State, it happened below the Eiffel Tower.
It really was, actually. It really was the original Kent State. It's absolutely true. The National Guard fired on the people.
How did your training as an art historian inform your writing of this book?
Well, I think that a lot of the detail that you've noticed and that some other people have also noticed, the detail that you find is details of what interiors looked like, of what furniture, how furniture functioned and so forth. And I really wanted to, I think, pay attention to trying to bring to life the visual and material experience of actually being there. So I spent a lot of time driving through the Auvergne and visiting chateaus, visiting different places, and really trying to capture in words. And this is something that I think art historians are trained to do, to sort of translate from the visual to the verbal. So to capture in words and bring to life what a place looked like or felt like, or what it might have been like to walk through these grand spaces at Versailles, for example.
And what was the most, or what were some of the really exciting things that you found when you were doing this?
Well, there were the dirty pictures.
Oh, right. They're dirty pictures.
And
books will be for sale.
Yeah, that was one of the more surprising things.
And where did you find those?
The dirty pictures. Yeah. On the internet, where one finds all dirty pictures. But in this case, it was the internet, it was the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale online. They've digitized in recent years, they've actually digitized a large number of their manuscripts and their images. And there is a fair amount of pornography from the era of the French Revolution, politically motivated pornography. Marie Antoinette is the focus of much of it, and that I had known and that had been fairly well written about, because Marie Antoinette was not a popular character. But I did not realize that Lafayette was often cast as her paramour in some of these episodes. And I don't think that I can describe them because I think that we're being taped for TV. But I will just say that some of them are eye-opening.
You touch on this a little bit, but because you did so much research and you cover so much time, you have to decide what to put in and what not to put in. And there's so many small little tidbits that are so fascinating and horrifying, like his wife, Adrienne de Noailles' mother, sister, and grandmother were killed. They had their heads chopped off by the guillotine on the same day. But that's just one little moment. You must have had many moments like that.
Yeah, I have to say that when you're reading about and visiting the places of the French Revolution, there are so many small details that, when you learn about them in history classes, tend to seem like just part of the grand sweep of history. But when you read them in personal narratives and you imagine what it might have been like for a woman to watch first her daughter and then her mother-in-law executed before her eyes, and then knowing that she herself was going to follow in that path, there's so much that's packed into that. And in order to make the book a reasonably readable length, you can't I couldn't find a way to go into great depth. So I guess in some cases I hoped that maybe less was more, and that simply stating these facts would be powerful enough to convey. I really tried to convey what it must have been like to really live through the terror, which was called the Reign of Terror at the time by the people who instituted it. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we know what it's like to live with terrorism, and I guess I tried to bring some of those details to life to give a sense of what it was like then, and maybe something that we can relate to now.
Mm-hmm. One thing that comes up often in the book is the issue of money. So Lafayette starts off not well off in comparison to the people he's hanging around with, and then he inherits a lot of money, and then he loses a lot of money. Did you think about money when you were writing this?
Yeah, a lot. So not my own personal money, but I did. But no, money actually plays a very large role in it. And I think this is part of the American, again, mythology of Lafayette, is that Lafayette bankrupted himself for the American cause, but it's actually not really true. He did clothe and feed his troops at his own expense, but that was actually entirely normal for generals in the 18th century. That's what they did. He bankrupted himself by living beyond his means. as many members of the nobility did in 18th century France. And reading through, this is one of those things where, picking up tidbits, the Library of Congress in DC has Lafayette's archives, and these include account books and letters and so forth. And one of the most interesting things to look at was actually looking at his account books and realizing that his own personal expenses for things like his box at the opera, his hair, his clothing, his habit of racing carriages through Paris and destroying the axles of his carriages in the process, that these things were actually so over the top, his expenses were so over the top, that we actually have a letter from the person who kept his books saying, excuse me, I know that you're interested in economizing, but the fact is that any economies to be made have got to start with you, and you have to start tomorrow. And he says that is the only way that you will find yourself in that happy state in which a man dies and bequeaths to his children some portion of his fortune. And so the accountant had clearly sort of lost it with Lafayette's expenditures. So it's just, all of this to me, I share not because I want at all to make fun of Lafayette, but really to make him human. And I think that that's really the point of the whole book, in a sense, is that we know Lafayette as a statue. We know Lafayette as a bust. We know him as a hero. But before he was a hero and a statue and a bust, he was a man. And he made mistakes. And a lot of us do. And I think that understanding that, his humanity, is, I think, important to really appreciating what he did, what he accomplished despite his human flaws.
Yeah, one of the, at least, characteristics that comes up often is what Jefferson called his canine appetite for popularity. Also, I mean, you could also call it enthusiasm, and his, and then he's also very idealistic, which is, you know, when you think about a 19-year-old who's enthusiastic and idealistic and wants to be popular, that paints a very clear picture.
Yeah.
But it's also his personality that you portray throughout his life, too. And then it gets him into trouble over the course of his life. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So Lafayette, it's true that Thomas Jefferson did in fact say that this was Lafayette's greatest flaw, was his canine appetite for popularity. He really wanted to be liked and loved, and it was actually very important to him, as it was to many people, I think, of his class and status in that period. His reputation was very important to him. And it was very important not only that he make a difference in the world, but also that he be remembered for having made a difference in the world. And that sometimes he pursued in ways that backfired. But on the whole, I think it was actually a pretty noble desire, ultimately, that fueled it. I think that he didn't want to be popular just for the sake of being popular, but I think he wanted to be popular because he had read the great books of Greek and Latin history, and he had learned to emulate the heroes of antiquity, and he envisioned himself, he was aware of the historic circumstances in which he lived, and he envisioned himself as taking the place and coming down to us through history, as he did.
And then he was also very influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment.
Yes.
And where did he get those ideas?
He got them, so it's interesting. He was born in, as I said, in the rural Auvergne, and originally he was really raised on mostly an education that consisted of slightly overblown tales of his ancestors' glory. Some of these tales turned out to be less glorious. For example, he had an uncle who died young because he, during a war, because he captured a soldier and put him on the back of his horse, on the saddle behind him, but he neglected to confiscate the captive's gun before he did that. So he was raised, though, on these tales of military glory, but he then went to Paris to be educated when he came into money. He was sent to Paris to be educated, and he attended schools that were really infused with Enlightenment ideals. And he was very much influenced by the same ideals that influenced Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Monroe. He was someone who read all of the documents that they had read, and then he read their documents. And then he went on to craft foundational documents for France, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that were based on American documents and that were written really in dialogue, literally with Jefferson. We have copies of them. This is, again, the kind of like strange thing that you discover when you spend 10 years, like 7 years reading through these things. We have documents of Lafayette's draft with Jefferson's handwriting, annotating it. He took some of Jefferson's ideas and ignored others, but yeah, he was very, very much a man of the French Enlightenment.
That's funny, that answers the first question we had from the audience.
Excellent. Well done.
Here's another question from the audience. Do you think your book and the new research you did will change how the French think of Lafayette?
No. Sorry.
All right, next question. Talk about turning historical and biographical details into a narrative.
Aha. Is Joe Salvatore here? Is that your question? I know my audience. Say that again. Talk about turning
historical and biographical details into a narrative.
Yeah, that was one of the most, I mean, I have to say that for me, that was one of the most challenging, but also one of the most fun parts of writing this book. As an academic, as a trained art historian, you're trained to care sort of slightly less about narrative. You're trained to, give the facts and just the facts. And the fact is that nobody wants to read just the facts. So I actually took this opportunity, since I was fortunate enough to be able to be writing for a trade publishing house. I was delighted to have the opportunity to actually write a book that I thought people might want to read, and that I might want to read, and that took all of these seemingly dry and potentially uninteresting details and really turned them into a rich, I would say, tapestry that through which you can really start to understand the look and the feel of the place, and through which I hoped to try to help people to understand or to imagine what it might have been like to be Lafayette or to be one of the people in Lafayette circles, although they were living so long ago. But their lives were really very like ours in very many ways. I mean, it's different, but also the same. And so I really tried to bring those narrative details together with the goal of sort of putting flesh on those statues.
Mm-hmm. Successfully.
Thank you.
Yeah. What contemporary political figures would you compare Lafayette to? What contemporary political figures?
Do we have any moderates left? He would be a moderate. A Rockefeller Republican.
Okay. So no. What is your favorite memory or episode from your experience of writing this book?
My favorite memory, aside from the Scotsman in the truck stop, I think that my favorite moment was actually probably that which I recount at the very end of the book, in an author's note, in which I attempt to go and visit Lafayette's grave in Paris, and over which an American flag flies. Lafayette's grave in Paris, as you might imagine based on everything that I've already said, is not a big tourist attraction. It's open for a few hours a week when the custodian is home, maybe. And so needless to say, I arrived on a day or a moment when the custodian was not home. So I found myself wandering aimlessly, and there was a chapel, and I went in. And I sat down, and that's actually where I found myself looking at the walls, and that's where I discovered engraved in the walls in the marble the names and occupations and dates of death and order of death of everybody who was executed on that one site at one particular site in Paris. And it turned out that they were all buried there. It was a mass grave, and that's actually why Lafayette's buried there. And while I was looking at this wall and really thinking about all this, a nun came in. And I had this wonderful conversation with this wonderful sister with whom I spoke about this question of, well, why do you think it is that Lafayette's a hero in America and not in France? And there was something, and her conclusion was basically that Lafayette's a complicated figure, and the French Revolution was a complicated time, and people don't like complicated stories, and people don't like to remember the French Revolution in its full complexity. But there was something about that moment. It places a nice bookend to my experience, because the book starts where I started, with this conversation with the curator at Versailles. You know, why should we have a bust of Lafayette? And then it ended with my sort of turning the question around to a French sister and saying, why don't you have a bust of Lafayette? And there was something about those two moments that were really sort of, I don't know, beautiful to me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you really take on the complexity of his life very well. One thing that stuck out to me was, and it's sort of a question that I had at the very beginning was, when is slavery going to rear its head? And you definitely take it on. Could you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So it's, slavery appears, actually, the very first appearance it makes is in 1777 when Lafayette arrives in South Carolina. His ship is actually lost. And they land, and they're actually greeted by 4 enslaved men who are out fishing at that moment. And so Lafayette's very first encounter with anyone in America is actually with 4 slaves. He becomes an abolitionist, and he becomes a very active member of the abolitionist movement. And in fact, he even goes so far as to attempt an experiment in gradual emancipation of slaves. And this part really tied me up in knots, as I think it tied him up, because what he did was he purchased a plantation in French Guiana, and he purchased the slaves on the plantation. And he purchased them with the intention of freeing the slaves. But when the French Revolution came, and all of his property was seized, the slaves were also seized as his property. So that he had purchased the plantation and the slaves intending to free them, but then he didn't. And the complexity of that kind of moral situation, I mean, I think that takes up only a small portion of the narrative, but it was probably the hardest part for me to write, because it was the single most complex and morally difficult.
Mm-hmm. This is a totally different topic. Question from the audience. Could you talk about Lafayette's relationship with Napoleon, who had him liberated from Austria after 5 years in prison?
Yeah, so Napoleon did have Lafayette liberated, but only under extreme pressure from international governments and from popular opinion around the world. What I actually think got Lafayette liberated was his wife, who was very, very clever. And when Lafayette was imprisoned, at a certain point, once it became apparent that Adrienne, his wife, was going to be able to survive the revolution, she took herself and her 2 daughters to the door of the prison in Austria and said to the Austrian authorities, if you're going to keep my husband, you're going to have to keep us too. And they let her in, but it became a cause célèbre throughout the world that the Austrians were keeping 3 innocent women imprisoned. And it became a story that really circulated in images and poems. It was debated on the floor of the House of Parliament in England. And it really placed pressure on Napoleon to do something about getting Lafayette out. That said, Napoleon had no love lost for Lafayette. And he actually brokered a deal with Lafayette's wife in 1799. Napoleon brokered a deal in which he said, okay, he can come back, but he can't come anywhere near Paris. He has to stay at a distance of some 35 miles around Paris, because Napoleon did not want to have a rival general around making trouble. So for 15 years during the Napoleonic era, Lafayette really lived a life of tremendous retirement. He created his own farm at La Grange, his wife's family estate, and he really, I think, tried to recreate there George Washington's Mount Vernon. So he created a farm that was an experimental farm. It was a place for agricultural improvements, and he saw this as a way of contributing to the betterment of French peasantry by helping them to experiment with and learn about new and better ways of growing and harvesting their crops. So Napoleon was really not a fan.
Yeah, just a side note, I love the kids' names.
Yes.
George Washington Lafayette is one of the kids.
Yes.
And another one is Virginie
Yeah.
Lafayette, named after Virginia. Do the other ones have American names?
No, those are the only two born after the American episode. But there's that great quote from Benjamin Franklin so Benjamin Franklin lived in Paris at the same time, and they were quite friendly, Lafayette and he. And Benjamin Franklin, when he heard that Lafayette had named a daughter Virginia, Franklin wrote to him, and it also got into the papers. I think it was probably Franklin who got it into the papers. But he wrote a sort of quipping letter to Lafayette saying that he hoped that he and Mrs. Lafayette would have 13 children so they could name one for each of the colonies. But he also said that he did feel sort of sorry for Ms. Connecticut, who might have to go through life with a rather difficult name.
So to go back to America, do you think the Americas would have lost the Revolutionary War without?
Yes.
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 Would have lost the Revolutionary War without Lafayette. Why?
Well, they certainly would. The Americans really, I believe, that we won the Revolutionary War in large part thanks to French support, both naval and ground support from France, and that French support. Before Lafayette, the French government had in fact been very quietly sending guns and ammunition and a few engineers here and there to the American side, but France did not want to come out in favor of the Americans because they wanted to maintain the appearance of neutrality with Great Britain. They had just ended the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, with Great Britain, and they wanted to maintain an appearance of neutrality with Britain. So they did not at all want to come out publicly in support of the Americans. When Lafayette left France, he did so with quite éclat, I think is the word that I use. He made quite a splash when he left France, and he made it sort of impossible for the French government to look the other way anymore, or to pretend that they were not supporting the American cause. So in a way, I think that Lafayette really forced the French government out into the open with their support of America, and then that in turn led to the support that led to the winning of the war.
So just to finish things off, what's your favorite story about Lafayette?
What is my favorite story about Lafayette? There are so many good ones. I think it's the one involving the Great Pyrenees, dogs. Because he was very active. So during this period of time when he was inactive in French politics, and even a little bit after that, he kept in constant contact with Americans. And he was constantly exchanging things with Americans. He was exchanging animals, he was exchanging plants, he was exchanging innovations in technology and so forth. And my favorite letter, I think, that I've ever come across in this research was from a Baltimore farmer who says, I have just received from the General Lafayette 4 puppies of enormous size. from the Pyrenees region of France. And as a dog lover, I love the image of Lafayette with his Great Pyrenees dog. So I think that's my favorite.
All right. Well, thank you so much. There are books for sale. It's really a great book. You must buy it and read it. And
Thank you,
you will
Louise.
know so much more about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Louise. And thank you, everybody.